Some Presbyterians tell me I'm just a closeted Anglican, but what I say is they're just closeted Southern Baptists. Hey guys, welcome back to KingdomCraft, where we build churches in Minecraft while talking about Christianity. Today I'm going to make the farm for my monastery so I can grow food and not die, while I explain why I'm not Anglican. I did a video about this about a year and a half ago, but that video wasn't very good, and I've developed a lot in my thinking since then. Back then I just made some very vague comments about church and state, which isn't even really relevant to Anglicanism anymore, since effectively the king is no longer the head of the church or whatever. So yeah, I'm going to give a more detailed explanation in this video of why I'm not Anglican. Because a lot of people think I'm high church for a Presbyterian. High church means, you know, more traditional, liturgical, sacramental, and low church means more like contemporary and evangelical. At least the way those terms are often used these days, and it's the way I used to use those terms. But I've lately been realizing that high church versus low church isn't the same as traditional versus contemporary. Because what low church during the Reformation meant was you still had a lot of those beautiful cathedrals, just minus the statues, icons, and over-complicated prayers and liturgies and stuff. That's what low church meant during the Reformation. During the Reformation, low church didn't mean any of this Baptist, evangelical, contemporary stuff. So, I used to call myself a high church Presbyterian because I'm a big stickler, I'm a big snob for traditional worship styles, the traditional look and architecture of churches, but that doesn't really have anything to do with high church versus low church, because a traditional Baptist church from the 1800s looks so much more like a Gothic cathedral than a Catholic church built in 2010. On average, of course you can find exceptions to everything. So lately I've stopped calling myself high church, I'm just traditional. And I know that if I was like a really, really high church Presbyterian, that would be more similar to Anglican, because Anglicans are more high church than Presbyterians. But lately I've been realizing I'm actually not that high church, and that's why I'm still a Presbyterian and not an Anglican. And there's really three ways in which I'm not exactly high church, even though I'm someone who cares a lot about church tradition and church beauty, traditional church architecture, traditional music, and all that. But that doesn't make me high church. So one of the clear examples of high church is church government. The more hierarchical a church government is, you could say the more high church that denomination is. So a distinctive feature of Anglicanism is that it's Episcopalian. That's why Episcopal is a synonym for Anglican. Episcopalian church government is one of the distinctives of Anglicanism. It's really the only, on paper, official difference between Anglicans and Presbyterians. We have what's called a Presbyterian government. That's where we get our name from, where we are governed by councils of elders. And we think that elder and bishop are the same in the Bible, which most Anglican scholars would admit that that's true in the Bible. So we don't see a need for a distinct office of bishop that is above elders. So what that means, really, is that the highest authority in the Presbyterian Church is just being an elder of a local congregation. There are higher authorities for, like, councils and stuff. There are higher councils, like presbyteries, synods, and general assemblies, but those aren't individual authorities. So, for an individual, the highest possible authority you could have in the Presbyterian Church is being an elder. Either a teaching elder or a ruling elder. A teaching elder is what's more commonly called a pastor or a minister, and a ruling elder is what's more commonly called just an elder. But they're really just two different vocations of the same office. And there is an office below elder, it's deacons. Deacons don't exactly have ruling authority, it's mostly just, they serve in the church. And that's kind of why I think women can be deacons. I know that's controversial, but it's not a modern view to say that women can be deacons. But in Presbyterianism, there's no higher authority for an individual than being an elder, a teaching elder or ruling elder. And I think that is a good hedge against corruption. And I have seen my fair share of corruption in the church, because as you guys all know, I am mainline Protestant. I am in one of those mainstream historic Protestant denominations that has largely been hijacked by people who are theologically liberal, by theological liberalism. And that's not the same as political liberalism. This is not a political channel. Theological liberalism means you take the claims of your religion less seriously. So when you see a lot of old Presbyterian churches with, you know, lesbian pastors, old Episcopal churches with lesbian bishops. Now you know where that comes from. It comes from theological liberalism, which is where we don't have to believe everything the Bible says. We can change the Bible. We can change what we think about the Bible to adapt to modern circumstances and stuff. And theological liberalism exists in all religions. There's theologically liberal synagogues, like Reform Judaism, which is what my family has a background in. That's theologically liberal Judaism, as opposed to Orthodox Judaism, which is theologically conservative Judaism. But yeah, so the mainline churches have theological liberalism, and this is true of the Anglican and Presbyterian mainline churches. So what that shows is that the Episcopal structure has not really done anything to stop the progressive hijack of the mainline denominations. But what the Episcopal structure has done is it's made it a lot harder for conservatives like me in liberal denominations to resist the liberal higher-ups. So basically, if you have a high church government structure, there's a lot more top-down authority than bottom-up authority. So that means the Anglican churches have a lot more top-down authority, and the Presbyterian churches have a lot more bottom-up authority, because we have, you know, elders that elect representatives to councils and stuff. They have bishops that just impose leadership on the lower councils. Impose leadership on the lower churches. And the United Methodist Church has like this weird mixture of government structures, but the United Methodist Church does have a very, very Episcopal structure because their bishops have a lot of power, and that's why it was so hard for the conservative majority, not the conservative minority, for the conservative majority to resist the measures that were being taken by the progressives in the United Methodist Church. And that's why the conservatives ended up leaving and forming the Global Methodist Church, which I think was a terrible idea. It's one of the worst examples of conservative retreatism, of conservatives running away rather than taking back what's rightfully theirs. But that's what happened, and it didn't help that the progressive bishops had so much authority. It didn't help that the bishops had so much authority over local congregations. And generally, the mainline churches that have done the best job in resisting a progressive takeover are ones with a more low church government structure, like the American Baptist Churches USA and the RCA, and the United Church of Christ, the UCC, is a very, very progressive mainline denomination, but because it's a congregational government structure, which is even more low church than Presbyterian, where the congregations are basically completely independent, because they have that structure, even if most of the denominations is like super duper progressive, there's also some really conservative UCC, United Church of Christ churches, and the higher ups in the denomination can't do anything about it. They just have to basically deal with the fact that there's conservatives in their mostly progressive denomination. So basically, because I'm a Calvinist, because I believe in total depravity and sin, I think that power, especially in the church, that having a lot of power in the hands of a few individuals is harmful way more frequently than it's helpful. Yes, there have been cases where Episcopal government structure has been helpful for resisting progressivism. The clearest example of this is in the Latvian Lutheran Church, where they used to ordain women, but they got a conservative archbishop who just banned that practice. And I think the Latvian Lutheran Church is the clearest example of a successful reconquista in the modern world, because it is the mainline Lutheran Church in Latvia. And trust me, it works wonders when you have a society where you have a strong mainline Protestant church that's still theologically conservative, that's still theologically orthodox, because in all these, you know, offshoot denominations like PCA, OPC, ACNA, they always have to worry about doing church plants and strip malls. If you have a historic mainline denomination that's still conservative, you don't have to worry about any of that. You can just have influence in society and build off of the achievements of ancestors from a more Christian age. You don't have to do all these church plants and build from scratch like a lot of these offshoot denominations are trying to do. So yeah, I'm not turning this into a Reconquista video, but I am saying that there are some examples of Episcopal structure being better for Reconquista and Episcopal structure being better for resisting progressive takeover, but that's the exception. That's not the rule. Generally speaking, a low church government structure where congregations have more independence is a lot better for resisting corruption in the church. Now, I don't think congregations should have too much independence, but that's why I'm not Congregationalist, because in the Southern Baptist Convention, when there's no official hierarchy, there becomes, like, unofficial hierarchies of personality cults, and that's why people like John MacArthur end up having, like, a cult-like following of a bunch of churches that base their entire theology around him. So I don't think that's good either. I think Presbyterian government is the best compromise between high church and low church. I think it helps fend off corruption from above, but also corruption from below. I think if you have an Episcopal government structure in the church, there's too much corruption from above. But if you have a Presbyterian government structure, then you'll have too much... if you have a Congregationalist government structure, where the congregations are independent and can do whatever they want, then you'll have too much corruption from below. But yeah, so obviously the biggest reason I'm not Anglican is that I don't think we need an Episcopal government structure. I don't think we need bishops as a distinct office from elders. And they will appeal to the fact that bishops are the historic practice in the church. But by historic, what that means is from around the year, from the mid-2nd century to the Reformation, basically every church was Episcopal. And I can basically grant that. But church fathers admit that it wasn't always this way. Like, you have that famous quote from St. Jerome where he says, elder used to be identical with bishop until divisions were introduced into the church by Satan, and that's why we ended up getting all these distinct hierarchy offices, because it used to be a bishop was just first among equals among other elders. Bishop used to be a distinct type of elder. I mean, really, bishops used to just be a synonym for elders. Then bishops became a distinct type of elder, like a first among equals, and then they gradually evolved into a distinct office from elder. It's clear in St. Ignatius, who's in the 2nd century, that there is a distinction between bishop and elder, but it's not clear that he has the same developed episcopal structure that we see later, like at the Council of Nicaea, or much later in the later Catholic and Orthodox churches. So I see it as a development, and most Catholic and Anglican scholars will admit that is a development. Like when I talk to Trent Horn is one of the most famous Catholic apologists. He admits that the Episcopal government structure is a development in the church, and he'll say it's a positive development. And I agree that just because something is a development in church history doesn't mean it's bad. There are a lot of developments in church history that I think are positive. Theology always develops throughout church history. As Karl Barth would say, theology is a science, and science is always improving. I think theology always is improving over time. It doesn't mean we can discard the past, but we should build on the past. So I don't think development is bad, but if something is a development, then that does mean it doesn't need to be the case for all people and at all time. So I don't think the historical argument for having bishops, for having an episcopal government structure really works, given the fact that that wasn't the case in the New Testament, and most of the apostolic fathers, except for Ignatius, seem to have more of a Presbyterian view of church government. And there are too many people on the server. There's no one around here where I am, in this little isolated part of this world, in this distant jungle far away from anyone. But there are way too many people on the server. And a lot of people think that I run this server on my computer. I'm running the server on my potato of a computer. People say that on the server a lot. It's not. I actually pay for a host somewhere, but I'm also a boomer when it comes to tech, so I don't know how to fix whatever problem causes the lag on my server. Anyway, so bishops are the number one reason why I'm not Anglican, but there's other reasons as well. Reason number two is that the whole history of Anglicanism has just been trying to find a compromise between Reformed and Roman Catholic, because the earliest Anglican theologians, like Thomas Cranmer, were nearly identical to, like, the Calvinist reformers. Thomas Cranmer was trained by the same guy John Calvin was trained by, Peter Martyr Vermigli, and, like, the early Anglican views of the Eucharist is literally just the Calvinist view of the Eucharist, where we receive the body of Christ spiritually but not physically. So if that were the case, then I would totally be Anglican, but if that were the case, Anglicanism would be just identical to Reformed theology. And to this day, you have a lot of Reformed Anglicans, and Reformed Anglicans are basically just Calvinists, but with bishops. Now, I will say that having bishops is a step away from the Reformed tradition, because most Reformed scholastics tend to reject that sort of monarchical view of church government. Like Francis Turretin, he wasn't, Anglican or Presbyterian because he was in Italy, he was in continental Europe, but he still still rejects the episcopal government structure of the church. So, I would say that generally, even if you are theologically reformed, having bishops is a step in the more Roman Catholic direction, but if that was the only thing, if that was like the only way in which Anglicans were distinct from other Reformed Christians, then I would be okay with it. Like, I'm not completely opposed to bishops either. I'd rather have a more democratic and bottom-up hierarchy of the church. But overall, Anglicanism has always tried to find a balance between Calvinism and Catholicism. That's why you'll have both Reformed Anglicans and Anglo-Catholics, and both of them claim they're the real Anglicans, and the other one is not the real Anglican. Like, Anglicans are very great at compromising with each other and compromising with other Christians. They're very eclectic. They're very good at finding the best aspects of other Christian traditions, but what Anglicans are not good at is agreeing with each other on what Anglicanism even is. If you ask some Anglicans, they'll say it's like a branch of the Reformation between Reformed and Lutheran, but if you ask other Anglicans, they'll say, no, it's really trying to find a middle way or a via media between Protestant and Catholic. So while Reformed Anglican is probably the closest thing to what I am, that's not what I am. I did a test recently, like a denominations test, and I realized that, yes, if I were not Presbyterian, I would probably be Anglican, and there's nothing wrong with that, and I have no problem with being Anglican, but if Reformed theology is an option, if Presbyterian, which is more purely part of the Reformed tradition, is one of my options, then why should I be Anglican? Because Anglican is often like a compromise between Catholicism and Calvinism. And that's why you have a lot of Anglo-Catholic theologians in the Anglican Church who do things that I don't think we should be doing. They do things like praying to Mary and the saints, and venerating icons. We shouldn't be doing that. It's like, if you're doing that, it's almost like the Reformation was for nothing. It's like, a lot of these Anglo-Catholics, they basically seem like Catholics who don't like the Pope, basically. Especially some of the more, like, really high church Anglicans, like, I think what Calvin Robinson used to be. Calvin Robinson, I think, recently joined the Old Catholic Church, which is literally just a branch of the Catholic Church that split from the Catholic Church after the First Vatican Council, where they made the Pope infallible. But generally speaking, within Anglicanism, within the Anglican tradition, they have parts of it that are basically just popeless Catholicism. And although I could be an Anglican and disagree with those things, and disagree with, you know, icon veneration and prayers to the saints, and other Catholic things, like, I believe in the Reformation. Because I am Reformed, I reject those practices. Being Reformed is not just tulip. It's not just predestination. I say this to my Baptist friends all the time. A lot of Baptists think they can be Reformed. A lot of people call themselves Reformed Baptist because they're Baptists who agree with predestination. And maybe they will say, oh, I agree with the London Baptist Confession as well. But I'll say being Reformed is more than just... It's more than just tulip. It's more than just adopting a certain set of propositions, like in the London Baptist Confession. Being Reformed, it's an entire tradition, and this tradition has largely rejected a lot of practices such as spiritual devotion to anyone but God. I don't think we should be praying to anyone but God. And yes, I'll say, oh, it's not really praying to them, it's asking them to pray for us. But there's layers and layers of assumptions built into that. There's the assumption that the saints in heaven are actually being bothered with our struggles down here on earth. There's also the assumption that they can somehow hear all of the prayers that are directed towards them. It's a lot of superstitions, it's a lot of assumptions, it's something that's clearly developed over time in church history, and the Reformation was all about getting rid of the practices, the worship practices that are not in the Bible, that slowly developed over the course of church history. That's what the Reformation was about. And that leads me to my third big reason, and it's that I believe in the regulative principle of worship. And basically every Anglican would reject this. The regulative principle of worship says that if a worship practice is not in the Bible, we shouldn't do it. And the logic for it is pretty simple, I think. There is a finite way of... There's a finite number of things that are right to do in worship. There's a finite number of right ways to worship God, and there's an infinite number of wrong ways to worship God. And I think this This distinction between worshiping the wrong God and worshiping the right God in the wrong way is why we have a distinction in the Bible between the first and second commandment. Like, for a long time, I didn't understand what the difference between the first and second commandment was. The first commandment was, you shall have no other gods before me, and the second commandment was, you shall not commit idolatry. And for the longest time, I was like, what's the difference between these two commandments? They're basically saying the same thing. And for a while, because of that, I favored the Jewish numbering of the commandments, where the first commandment is not, you shall have no other gods before me. The first commandment in the Jewish numbering is just, I am the Lord your God. It's just like the preface to the rest of the commandments. But the regulative principle of worship helped me understand the distinction between the first and second commandments. And this is also kind of why Catholics and Lutherans collapse the first and second commandments into two. And then they separate the commandment about coveting into do not covet your neighbor's wife and then do not covet anything else, which I think is a kind of nonsensical way to split that commandment. It's like, why do you need a distinct commandment about coveting your neighbor's wife if there's already a commandment about not coveting things and a commandment about not committing adultery, which Jesus says applies to lusting after women in general? I don't know. I think it makes a lot more sense in the Ten Commandments to say that the first and second commandment are distinct. So that means the first commandment says, do not worship false gods. That's pretty obvious. But the second commandment means do not worship the true God in a false way. Everyone forgets that with the golden calf, people weren't trying to worship a different God other than the God of Israel. They were trying to worship the one true God through that golden calf. They wanted to be able to see God physically somehow. And I think that's the problem with icons. People who use icons in worship, people who worship God through icons will say, oh, we're not like worshiping a different God, we're worshiping the one true God through these icons, but that's also what the people with the golden calf were trying to do. Now, they'll say it's different because with the incarnation, Jesus sanctified matter, he took on human flesh, he made the invisible God visible. They are valid arguments. I still don't agree with them. But I think the principle applies, even if you do believe in icons, which I don't. The principle still applies that you should not worship the right God in the wrong way. The first commandment says you need to worship the right God, and the second commandment says you need to worship the right God in the right way. And there are many stories in the Old Testament about people being struck dead instantly for worshiping God slightly the wrong way. Now, I think those are not normative things. I don't think that always happens. If it did, then people would be dropping dead like flies. I think it's a story, a true story, but it's a story. It's something God did to show us how important his holiness is. And that means right worship of God is very important. And to make sure we're doing it right, we need to make sure we're only doing things that the Bible tells us to do in worship. So that means, now some people take this to extremes, people in the RPCNA, it's a very, very strict Presbyterian denomination I did a video on a few episodes ago. They'll say that we shouldn't even sing any songs that are not in the Bible. We should only be singing psalms. I mean, I don't agree with that, but the reason I don't agree with that is because you can make a biblical case that people sing songs that were not in the Bible in worship. And I also think, unlike some of the more strict Calvinists, I think we can celebrate holidays like Christmas and Easter because there's biblical evidence that Jesus celebrated Hanukkah, which is not a holiday in the Bible, but that didn't stop him from celebrating it. So I don't have the strictest application of the regulative principle necessarily, but I still believe in it. And because of the regulative principle, I don't think we should make prayers to saints. I don't think we should make prayers to Mary. And there are decent arguments that people make for why we should do them. I'm not going to say it's a completely absurd thing to think of because, you know, a lot of important people in church history did venerate saints, did pray to saints. So I'm not going to say that it's completely wrong always, no matter what. I mean, I think it is wrong, but I don't think you're like a false Christian or a pagan if you do it, because then I'd have to like anathematize much of the early church. But I think even if you can think of good arguments for why we should do a worship practice, if it's not in the Bible, we shouldn't do it. So it's like, there are admittedly good arguments for veneration of saints, but it's not based on the Bible. It's based on, like, a long series of logical deductions and assumptions based on things that are in the Bible, but I think that's not a sufficient justification for doing something in worship. It's like altar calls. You can make a practical argument for why we should do altar calls, because maybe it gets a few people saved in that moment. It gets a few people to make that leap and put their faith in Jesus. But the Bible doesn't tell us to do altar calls, so we shouldn't do it in worship. And the regulative principle of worship only applies to worship. It does not apply to things we do outside of church. So that there's no Bible verse that explicitly says the church needs to start universities, but I think the church absolutely does need to do that, and it's a very good thing the church has done throughout history. But obviously that shouldn't be in worship. The church shouldn't be starting a university and studying, you know, I don't know, Plato or Cicero in a worship service. You should do that outside the worship service. Anyway, the final reason I'm not Anglican is that I am iconoclast. A lot of people are surprised when they hear I'm iconoclast, given that I'm kind of high church. I care about church history. Well, I don't think I'm high church. I am what a lot of people think of as high church. And, I care a lot about church councils and creeds and stuff, but I am iconoclast. People shouldn't be surprised about that, because iconoclasm is explicitly taught by the Westminster Confession, which I hold to, by the way. It says we should not make any images of God. That means no images of any person of the Trinity. That includes Jesus. Yes, Jesus has a human nature. He took on a human nature. He took on human flesh. But even according to his human nature, he's still God. If you say we're only depicting Jesus' human nature, that's Nestorianism. I think the council, the Seventh Ecumenical Council, the Second Council of Nicaea, I think that was a false council. You can clearly tell it was a false council just by reading it and comparing it to the other councils. The other ones are all about Jesus. They're all based on Scripture. The Second Council of Nicaea is just a reaction by a bunch of emperors to the iconoclast movement that was sweeping through the church, which was in response to growing iconography that wasn't really happening in the church. It's also very clear that the early church did not venerate icons. A lot of people, because of the Seventh Ecumenical Council, will say that iconoclasm is a heresy. If that's the case, then there were a lot of heretics in the early church that were not being addressed, because you have the Synod of Elvira. It's an actual council in the early church, not an ecumenical council. But as a Protestant, I don't think there's any ontological distinction between an ecumenical council and a local council. One is just bigger. Like these modern Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic apologists will act like ecumenical councils are this magic authority in the church that is like the one infallible source of authority outside the Bible. But I really don't see why an ecumenical council is any different from just a bigger local council. So the Synod of Elvira condemned the use of icons in church. So if iconoclasm is a heresy, which the Second Council of Nicaea does say, then you're basically damning much of the early church, which I don't think you want to do. So that's why I reject the Second Council of Nicaea, not the First Council of Nicaea. Obviously, we shouldn't be rejecting that, but the Second Council of Nicaea was many, many hundreds of years later, and it taught things completely different. So I am iconoclast, because I don't think we should make any images of God, and every image of God that people make is really a projection of their personal agendas onto God. For example, medieval pictures of Jesus made him seem very, strong, powerful, and condemning. Modern pictures of Jesus make him seem very soft, meek, and mild, because we are projecting our own culture onto Jesus and therefore onto God. That's why I don't support any images of Jesus, not even the Jesus Storybook Bible. I don't support shows like The Chosen. Some people say they don't want to watch The Chosen because it's Mormon or whatever, because Mormons were involved in the production of it. I don't know about that. I haven't investigated that, but it doesn't matter to me. Like, you refuse to watch The Chosen because it's Mormon. I refuse to watch The Chosen because I believe in the second commandment. We are not the same. I believe that we should not make any images of God at all. So I think the 4 reasons I'm not Anglican, despite, having a very high affinity towards tradition and beauty and traditional worship practices, is, number 1, I still am not convinced that we need episcopal government structure. I think it does more harm than good in the modern day. Number 2, I think Anglicanism is too much of a compromise with Roman Catholicism. Number 3 is that I believe in the regulative principle of worship. And number 4, I am iconoclast. So I'm going to speed this up while I do some more work on my monastery here.